The world beneath the coat was a universe of darkness and tremors. For Lena, time had dissolved into the rhythmic clatter of the wheels and the frantic beating of her own heart. The heavy canvas was a shroud, blocking out the desolate landscape and the harsh light. But it couldn't block out the fear. It was a living thing inside her, a cold knot in her stomach that sent shudders through her limbs. She was acutely aware of the man beside her, a mountain of quiet intensity. She could feel the solid warmth of his body through his clothes, a stark contrast to the icy dread that filled her. He hadn't spoken, hadn't moved to touch her, yet his presence was the only anchor in her swirling terror. Minutes stretched into an eternity. With every lurch of the train, she expected the door to crash open. With every distant sound, she flinched, convinced it was them. She had to say something, had to give voice to the plea that was choking her. She shifted, her face brushing against the rough wool of his shirt, and the words came out in a rush of air, so quiet they were nearly lost in the noise of the train. "Please, don't let them take me." The whisper was a tiny, desperate thing, yet it landed in the silence between them with the weight of a stone. Caleb didn't move, but Lena felt a subtle change in the man beside her. It was as if the heat he radiated intensified, the stillness of his muscles hardening from stone into steel. He had been a passive shelter. Now he was an active shield. He still said nothing, but the air around him grew taut, charged with a sudden and dangerous energy. He had heard her. He had accepted the plea. The bargain, unspoken and unasked for, was struck. And then came the sound. It started as a vibration felt through the floorboards, a rhythmic thudding that was different from the train's familiar dance. It was the sound of heavy boots, purposeful and unhurried, coming down the narrow corridor of the adjoining car. Lena went rigid, her breath catching in her throat. Her trembling ceased, replaced by a paralyzing stillness. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Thump, thump, thump! They were just outside now. They stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the sound had been. Lena could picture them out there, listening. A bead of cold sweat traced a path down her spine. She wanted to shrink, to dissolve into nothingness, to become a part of the shadows under the coat. The handle on the car door rattled violently, and with a deafening screech, the door was shoved open. A wave of stale air, smelling of cheap whiskey and unwashed bodies, flooded the carriage, and with it came the men. There were 3 of them, and they filled the doorway, blocking the light, their bulky forms casting long, menacing shadows that stretched across the floor. From her sliver of vision under the hem of the coat, Lena could see their boots, worn leather, scuffed and caked with mud, with heavy iron heels that had made the sound. She squeezed her eyes shut, a prayer dying on her lips. Caleb did not move. He remained seated, his face turned towards the window as if he were utterly absorbed by the passing sagebrush. The duster still covered the girl beside him, a seamless extension of his own form. To the men who had just entered, he was nothing more than a lone passenger, a dusty cowboy of no consequence, minding his own business. "Ain't here," a gravelly voice grunted. The sound was thick with impatience. "Check under the seats," another voice, higher and thinner, commanded. "She's on this train. Old man at the last stop saw her." The first man, a barrel-chested brute with a thick neck and hands like slabs of meat, lumbered into the car. His eyes scanned the empty benches, his gaze dull and incurious. The second man followed, smaller and weaselly, with darting eyes that missed nothing. The third man, clearly the leader, remained framed in the doorway. He was taller than the others, with a long, cruel face and a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a look of perpetual anger. He wore a holster tied low on his thigh, the butt of a pistol polished from frequent use. The brutish one kicked at a piece of loose floorboard. "Empty. Last car. Where else could she be?" "Maybe she jumped," the weasel suggested, peering out the grimy window. The leader in the doorway finally spoke, his voice a low, dangerous drawl. "She ain't got the nerve to jump. She's here, and she has something that belongs to Mr. Blackwood." He took a step into the car, his eyes slowly sweeping the space, and for the first time, they settled on Caleb. He looked at the solitary figure, at the dusty hat and the broad shoulders under the heavy coat. His eyes narrowed. There was something about the man's stillness that was unnatural. In a world of constant motion and nervous energy, Caleb was a point of absolute calm, and it was unsettling. "You," the leader said, his voice sharp. "You seen a girl, young, dark hair, looks scared out of her mind." Caleb did not turn. He did not acknowledge the question. He continued to stare out the window, his profile a rigid line against the light. The brutish man took a threatening step forward. "Hey, Silas is talking to you, Mr." It was then that Caleb finally moved. He turned his head slowly, deliberately, and fixed his gaze on the three men. He didn't rise. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply looked at them. The shadow from his hat's brim receded, and they saw his eyes. They were pale, almost colorless in the dim light, and they were utterly devoid of fear. They held a cold, flat emptiness that was more intimidating than any open threat. It was the look of a winter sky over a frozen lake, vast and unforgiving, hinting at a dangerous depth beneath the surface. His gaze passed over the brute and the weasel, dismissing them as irrelevant, and locked onto Silas, the leader. Silas felt the force of that stare like a physical blow. He was a man accustomed to inspiring fear, to being the most dangerous presence in any room. But the cowboy's eyes held a different kind of danger. It wasn't the hot-headed anger of a barroom brawler, but the cold, patient deadliness of a wolf. There was a promise in that gaze, a silent oath that if a line was crossed, the consequences would be swift, absolute, and bloody. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the creak of the carriage and the relentless clatter of the wheels. The two henchmen shifted uncomfortably, looking to their leader for a cue. They had come expecting to corner a frightened girl, not to face off against this. Silas held Caleb's gaze, a battle of wills playing out in the rattling train car. He could feel the eyes of his men on him. To back down now would be to lose face, but to push forward felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark. The cowboy hadn't said a word, yet he had taken complete control of the situation. Finally, with a curse muttered under his breath, Silas broke eye contact. He spat on the floor. Waste of time. She must have gotten off at the last water stop. Let's check the front cars again. The brute looked relieved. The weasel was already backing towards the door. They had their excuse. They could leave without their pride being completely shattered. The two of them shuffled out of the car, their heavy boots suddenly sounding clumsy and loud. Silas lingered for a second more, throwing one last, hateful glare at Caleb. "You're lucky you didn't see nothing," he sneered, the threat in his voice thin and unconvincing. He turned to follow his men. Beneath the coat, Lena's body went limp with a relief so profound it left her dizzy. They were gone. He had done it. Without a word, without a weapon, he had made them leave. A wave of gratitude, fierce and overwhelming, washed over her. But the ordeal was not over. Silas had reached the doorway when he suddenly stopped. He had been so focused on the cowboy's eyes that he hadn't processed the whole picture. The man's duster. It was heavy, far too heavy for the heat of the day, and it was draped oddly, hanging with a bulk that didn't match the man's frame. A flicker of suspicion, then certainty, flashed in his eyes. He turned back, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his scarred face. "Hold on a minute," he said, his voice soft and triumphant. "That's a mighty big coat you got there, friend." The moment the words were spoken, Caleb's stillness shattered. He didn't wait for Silas to take another step. He didn't wait for the inevitable demand to stand up. His calculation was instantaneous. A fight here was a losing proposition. 3-1, in a confined space, with the girl as a liability. The only option was the one no sane person would take. In a single, explosive motion, he was on his feet. His left hand shot out and grabbed Lena's arm, yanking her from her hiding place. She gasped, stumbling into the open, her eyes wide with renewed terror as she saw Silas's triumphant grin. Caleb didn't give her time to think. He hauled her with him, his grip like an iron band around her bicep. He wasn't moving towards the door Silas had just vacated. He was moving towards the back of the car, towards the solid rear wall. Silas and his men, hearing the commotion, turned back, their expressions shifting from surprise to rage as they saw the girl. "Get them!" Silas roared. But Caleb was already there. His free hand slammed against a heavy iron latch set into the wall. It was a freight access door, rusted and stiff from disuse. He threw his shoulder into it, grunting with the effort. The metal groaned in protest. Lena, dragged along with him, could only watch in horrified confusion. The men were charging down the length of the car now, their boots pounding on the wooden floor. With a final, desperate heave, Caleb wrenched the latch free. The door, no longer secured, slid sideways with a deafening shriek of metal on metal. An impossible reality opened up before them. The back of the train was gone, replaced by a roaring, dizzying blur of motion. The wind hit them like a physical blow, a solid wall of air that tore the breath from their lungs and screamed in their ears. The wooden railroad ties blurred into a single, continuous ribbon, flanked by the rushing red dirt and whipping sagebrush of the desert. The world was a chaotic vortex of speed and sound. Lena screamed, but the wind snatched the sound away. She tried to pull back, to dig her heels in, her mind rebelling against the madness of what was happening. But Caleb's grip was unbreakable. He pulled her flush against the opening, the roar of the wind and the ground a terrifying abyss at her feet. He leaned in close, his mouth next to her ear, and his first and only word to her was a harsh, guttural command shouted over the gale. "Jump!" He didn't wait for her to obey. He didn't give her a choice. As the thundering boots of their pursuers closed in, he wrapped his arm around her waist, lifted her off her feet, and threw them both out into the screaming emptiness. For one heart-stopping second, they were airborne, suspended between the speeding train and the unforgiving earth. Then, gravity took hold, and they fell. The impact was not a single event, but a violent, tearing explosion of sensation. There was no ground, only a brutal collision with a world made of gravel and thorns. The air was driven from Lena's lungs in a pained gasp. She and Caleb were a tangled knot of limbs and momentum, rolling through a landscape that seemed intent on skinning them alive. Sagebrush, with branches as hard as wire, clawed at her face and arms, tearing her dress and leaving fiery trails on her skin. Rocks, sharp and unforgiving, hammered against her ribs, her hips, her skull. The world was a spinning, chaotic nightmare of red dust, blue sky, and searing pain. They tumbled to a stop in a cloud of their own making, a heap of bruised flesh and torn clothing at the bottom of the shallow railway embankment. For a moment, Lena knew nothing but the iron taste of blood in her mouth and the screaming of a dozen different agonies in her body. The train was still a receding thunder in the distance, its whistle a mournful cry that mocked their desperate gamble. Then, a new sound cut through her daze, the screech of metal on metal as the train's brakes were finally thrown. They were stopping. The thought pierced through her pain with a fresh spike of terror. They were stopping for them. Before she could even process the thought, Caleb was moving. He untangled himself from her with a lithe, animal grace that defied the brutal landing. He was on his feet in an instant, his face a mask of grim urgency, caked with dust and streaked with a thin line of blood from a cut on his temple. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He didn't offer a hand. He grabbed the front of her torn dress, hauling her to her feet with a force that sent a jolt of agony through her bruised ribs. "Get up!" he rasped, his voice raw and harsh. "Now!" Her legs were jelly, her head spinning. The world tilted violently. "I can't," she whimpered, her voice a pathetic croak. You will. His grip shifted from her dress to her upper arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like a vice. He didn't give her the option to collapse. He started running, half dragging, half carrying her away from the tracks, away from the slowing train. Every step was a fresh torment. A sharp stone had sliced through her thin shoe, and a fiery pain shot up her leg with each footfall. Her lungs burned as if she'd inhaled hot coals. The sun, a merciless white disk in the sky, beat down on them, baking the dry air and turning the world into a furnace. Behind them, she could hear shouts, thin and sharp on the wind, carried from the now stationary train. They had been seen. Caleb ran with a long, ground-eating stride, his eyes scanning the terrain ahead. He was no longer just a man. He was an instinct, a creature of survival in its natural element. He navigated the treacherous ground with an uncanny certainty, weaving around the densest patches of thorny scrub and avoiding the sections of loose shale that could send them sprawling. He pulled her along relentlessly, a silent engine of desperation. Lena stumbled, her feet catching on roots and rocks, but he never let her fall. His grip was the only thing keeping her upright, the one constant in a world of pain and fear. "They're coming," she gasped, her words torn apart by her ragged breaths. She risked a glance over her shoulder. 3 figures, small with distance but unmistakably their pursuers, were scrambling down the embankment from the train. Caleb didn't look back. I know. They ran on, plunging deeper into the vast, indifferent wilderness. The landscape was a broken sea of low hills, dry washes, and rocky outcrops, all painted in shades of ochre and rust. It offered 1,000 places to hide and 1,000 places to die. Caleb seemed to have a destination in mind, his course unwavering. He was heading for a line of jagged, rocky ridges that rose from the plains a few miles distant. It was their only hope of breaking the line of sight. But their pursuers were gaining. The men were unburdened, driven by anger and the promise of whatever reward Mr. Blackwood offered. Their shouts grew louder, punctuated by the occasional crack of a pistol shot, the bullets whining harmlessly overhead but serving their purpose, fraying Lena's already shattered nerves. Caleb suddenly veered to the left, pulling her down into a shallow, dry gully. The ground here was soft sand, and it slowed their pace, sucking at their feet. Lena's legs felt like leaden weights. She was reaching the end of her endurance. The knot of fear in her stomach had been joined by the cold, sick certainty that she couldn't go on. "Please," she begged, tears of pain and exhaustion tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "I can't." Caleb stopped so abruptly she nearly collided with him. He pushed her down behind a cluster of sun-bleached boulders. His hand clamped over her mouth before a sob could escape her. "Be quiet," he hissed, his pale eyes blazing with an intensity that silenced her more effectively than his hand. He crouched beside her, his body tense, listening. The sounds of pursuit were closer now. They could hear the crunch of boots on gravel, the labored breathing, the angry curses as the men fought their way through the same harsh terrain. They were following their tracks in the sand. Caleb's eyes darted around, assessing their position. It was a poor one. The gully offered temporary cover, but it was a trap, a channel that would lead their pursuers directly to them. They needed a distraction, something to break the trail. His gaze fell on a dense, tangled clump of greasewood and dead brush a few yards away. An idea, desperate and dangerous, formed in his mind. He pulled a small, worn leather pouch from his belt, and from it, he took a piece of flint and a small shard of steel. He looked at Lena, his expression unreadable. "Stay here. Do not move. Do not make a sound." Before she could react, he was gone, moving in a low crouch, keeping the boulders between him and the direction of their pursuers. He moved with a speed and silence that was startling. A ghost in the shimmering heat. He reached the pile of dry brush, knelt, and began to strike the flint against the steel. Sparks flew, tiny stars in the oppressive daylight. He worked with a frantic economy of motion, his hands sure and steady despite the urgency. He shielded the sparks with his body, coaxing them into the tinder dry leaves he had gathered. Lena watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. The shouts were so close now. She could almost make out the words. Any second, a head would appear over the rise. A tiny wisp of smoke curled up from Caleb's hands. Then another, a small, hungry flame licked at a dry twig. He gently blew on it, nurturing it, feeding it more leaves. The flame grew, catching hold of the brittle branches of the greasewood. The plant, rich with natural oils, was notoriously flammable. With a sudden whoosh, the entire bush erupted in a tower of greasy, black smoke and angry orange flame. Caleb was already moving, scrambling back to her, grabbing her arm again. Go. He pulled her up and out of the other side of the gully, keeping low. The fire was a roaring, crackling beast now, spewing a thick, choking column of black smoke into the clear blue sky. It was a beacon, a signal that could be seen for miles. It was also a screen. "They'll see the smoke," Lena cried, her voice hoarse. "That's the point," he grunted, pulling her into a punishing run again. "They'll go to the fire. We go the other way." It was a brilliant, simple deception. The smoke obscured their escape route and created a false destination. They could hear confused shouts from behind them as their pursuers reacted to the sudden blaze. For a precious few minutes, the chase was forgotten as the men dealt with the unexpected threat of a brush fire. Caleb used that time without mercy. He pushed them harder than before, their path now angling sharply away from the fire and towards the rocky ridges. The ground became steeper, more broken. They were climbing now, scrambling over ledges and through narrow gaps in the rock. The solid stone was a relief after the treacherous sand. It held no tracks. Lena's body was a symphony of agony, but the immediate fear of capture had been replaced by a sliver of something else, a desperate, fragile hope. The man beside her was not just a runner. He was a thinker, a survivor. He knew this land, its dangers and its secrets, and he was using them to their advantage. Finally, breathless and bleeding, they reached a narrow cleft in the rock face, almost completely hidden by a curtain of ancient, gnarled juniper. Caleb pushed her inside without ceremony. The space was no more than a deep crack in the stone, cool and dark and smelling of damp earth. It was barely wide enough for the two of them to stand side by side. Caleb pressed himself against the opening, peering through a small gap in the branches, his pistol now drawn and held ready in his hand. Lena sagged against the cold, rough wall of the fissure, her legs finally giving out. She slid down to the dusty floor, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. The silence in the small space was profound, broken only by her own ragged, painful gasps for air and the frantic thumping of her heart. They waited. Time ceased to have meaning. It was measured only in the slow drip of sweat down Caleb's temple, the shifting of dust motes in the single ray of light that pierced their hiding place, and the distant, fading crackle of the fire he had set. After what felt like a lifetime, the sounds they had been dreading returned, voices carried on the capricious wind. They were distant, distorted, but they were there. Lena held her breath, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. "The smoke came from over here. Damn fool Cowboy probably set the whole territory on fire." Tracks disappeared back on the rocks. They could be anywhere. The voices swirled, sometimes seeming to come closer, sometimes fading away. Lena squeezed her eyes shut, praying to a god she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. She felt Caleb shift beside her, his body becoming even more still, more solid, a wall of living rock between her and the danger outside. One of the voices rose in frustration, much closer than the others. "There's nothing here, just rocks and heat. We lost them." "Mister, Blackwood ain't gonna like that," another voice grumbled. "Then you go tell him," the first voice snapped back. "I've had enough of this godforsaken dust bowl. She ain't worth dying of thirst for. Let's head back to the tracks before the train leaves without us." There was a moment of grumbled debate, and then the sound of footsteps, moving away, fading. Lena and Caleb remained frozen, listening. The wind sighed through the juniper, a lonely, mournful sound. The buzz of a fly echoed in their small cave. The sun beat down on the world outside. The minutes ticked by, agonizingly slow. They listened until their ears strained against the silence, until the only sounds left were the ones that had always been there, the wind, their own breathing, the slow, steady pulse of the earth. The shouts were gone. They had vanished, swallowed by the vast, empty spaces of the plains, as if they had never been. Only then did Caleb relax, the tension leaving his shoulders in a long, silent exhalation. He holstered his pistol and turned from the entrance. In the dim light, his eyes found Lena, huddled on the floor. He looked at her torn dress, the scratches on her face and arms, the exhausted pallor beneath the grime. His gaze was steady, unreadable. He had saved her. He had thrown them from a moving train, run her until her body gave out, and outsmarted 3 armed men in a land that offered no quarter. And now they were here, safe for the moment, but utterly alone, miles from anywhere, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the wits that had gotten them this far. The adrenaline that had fueled them began to recede, leaving behind a deep, profound exhaustion and the sharp, throbbing reality of their injuries. The silence stretched, filled with the unspoken questions of what came next. Outside, the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and red, the color of blood and fire. The escape was over. The survival had just begun. The sun bled out across the horizon, and the world cooled with surprising speed. In the narrow cleft of rock, the encroaching chill was a clammy hand on their skin. The brief sanctuary that had saved them was becoming a cold, dark prison. For a long time, neither of them moved. Lena sat on the stone floor, her body a single, unified ache, while Caleb stood watch, a silent sentinel against the deepening twilight. The initial wave of relief had passed, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that felt heavier than any stone. They were alive, but they were stranded, injured and exposed. Finally, Caleb turned from the entrance, his form a dark silhouette against the last purple vestiges of daylight. "We can't stay here," he said. His voice was quiet, stripped of the harshness it had held during the chase. Now just a low, rough sound that seemed to be scraped from the very landscape around them. The cold will set in, and the animals will be moving. Lena looked up at him, the effort to lift her head immense. The thought of moving, of forcing her screaming muscles to obey, was unbearable. "Where can we go?" Her voice was a dry, cracked whisper. He didn't answer right away. He looked out into the gathering dark, his gaze fixed on something she couldn't see. "There's a place, not far." Not far, she thought with a flicker of bitter irony. Felt like the other side of the moon. But she saw the resolve in his posture, the unyielding set of his shoulders. There was no choice. To stay here was to surrender to the wilderness, to let the cold and the dark claim them. She used the rock wall to push herself up, her body protesting with a chorus of sharp, grinding pains. Her ankle, the one with the cut, throbbed with a fiery intensity, and she bit back a cry as she put weight on it. Caleb saw her flinch. He moved to her side and, without a word, bent down. Before she could protest, he had scooped her into his arms. The movement was surprisingly gentle, yet firm and certain. Lena was too shocked, too exhausted to resist. Her head fell against his shoulder, the rough canvas of his duster scratching her cheek. He smelled of dust, sweat, and the faint, clean scent of the juniper he'd brushed past. He carried her as if she weighed nothing, his stride sure and steady as he stepped out of the ravine and into the vast, star-dusted night. Their journey was a slow, painful crawl through a dreamscape of shadows and stone. The moon had risen, a sliver of bone-white light that did little to illuminate the treacherous ground. Caleb moved with a quiet, unnerving confidence, as if he could see in the dark. He knew the land, the feel of it under his boots, the way the wind whispered through a certain gap in the rocks, the precise location of a game trail that offered easier passage. He was a part of this place, and Lena, held securely against his chest, was a trespasser, a piece of flotsam carried along by his current. She drifted in and out of a state that was not quite sleep, but not quite consciousness either. She was aware of the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, the steady beat of his heart against her ear, the low grunt of effort he made as he navigated a particularly steep incline. The pain in her body subsided into a dull, constant throb, a background noise to the immense silence of the plains at night. The world had shrunk to this single point of contact, this small bubble of warmth and strength in an ocean of cold and dark. For the first time since she had stumbled onto that train, a sliver of her mind, the part that had been screaming in terror for what felt like an eternity, fell quiet. She didn't know how long they walked. It could have been an hour or a lifetime. She was roused from her stupor when Caleb finally stopped. He let her slide gently to her feet, though he kept a steadying hand on her arm as her legs threatened to buckle. They were standing on a low ridge, looking down into a small, cup-like valley that was cupped in the palm of the surrounding hills. It was a secret place, invisible from the open plains, sheltered from the relentless wind, and there, in the center of the valley floor, bathed in the soft, milky light of the moon, was a small, dark shape, a house. As they drew closer, she could see more details. It wasn't just a house, but a small, hard-won homestead, a cabin built of dark, weathered logs, with a stone chimney that stood crooked but defiant against the sky. Beside it was a small, listing barn, its wood bleached to a ghostly silver by the sun and wind. There was a corral with a single, lean horse that lifted its head and nickered softly at their approach. A stone well, a few rows of what might have been a garden, now mostly fallow under the moonlight. The place was not pretty. It was battered, worn, and looked as if it were clinging to the earth by its fingernails. But it was standing. It was whole. It was a shelter. They reached the hard-packed dirt of the yard, and Caleb finally let go of her arm. He walked to the well, his movements filled with the easy familiarity of a man who had performed the same task 1,000 times. The squeak of the windlass was a loud, lonely sound in the immense quiet. He drew up a bucket of water, the splash echoing in the still night air. He brought the dipper to her, his face an unreadable mask of shadows in the moonlight. Lena drank, the water so cold it made her teeth ache. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. It washed the dust and blood from her mouth and seemed to bring her back to life, clearing the fog of pain and exhaustion from her mind. She drank until she could drink no more, the cool water a balm to her raw throat. She looked from the humble cabin to the silent man beside her. She didn't understand. She had assumed he was a drifter, a wanderer like so many others, with no ties and no home. But this place, this was a home. It was a place someone had built, had fought for. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Caleb took the dipper from her and drank deeply himself. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and stared at the dark cabin, at the familiar lines of the roof against the star-strewn sky. A long moment passed before he answered, his voice low and flat, carrying on the night air. "My place." The words settled over Lena with a quiet shock. His place. This forgotten homestead at the edge of nowhere belonged to this silent, violent man who had jumped from a train to save her. The realization didn't answer any questions. It only created a dozen more. A profound sense of displacement washed over her. She had been saved, but she had been brought to a place that was utterly his, a world she had no part in. She was an intruder, a piece of trouble that had washed up on his shore. She didn't know the rules here. She didn't know her place. She felt a sudden, desperate need to be useful, to do something, anything, to earn the water she had just drunk, the ground she was standing on. Her eyes fell on a rough besom broom leaning against the cabin wall. Without thinking, she walked over, her limp more pronounced now, and picked it up. The handle was smooth and worn from use. She began to sweep the porch, the rhythmic scrape of the bristles on the wood, a comforting, solid sound. It was a simple, mindless task, something to anchor her spinning thoughts. She swept away the dust and the fallen leaves, creating a small circle of order in the vast wilderness. She didn't know what else to do. Caleb watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable, before he turned and disappeared into the dark interior of the cabin. A few moments later, a faint, flickering light appeared in the window as he lit a lantern. He did not call to her or tell her to stop. He simply let her be. When the small porch was clean, her gaze fell on a pile of split logs stacked haphazardly near the door. She knelt, her bruised knees protesting, and began to stack the wood, placing each piece carefully to form a neat, solid wall. The rough bark scraped her torn hands, but the work felt good. It was real. It was something she could control. After the wood, she saw a bucket of grimy-looking potatoes and carrots by the water pump. She carried them to the well and began to wash them in the cold, clear water, scrubbing the red earth from their skins with a small, stiff brush she found nearby, sweeping, stacking, washing. These were the humble rituals of a home, and by performing them, she felt a tiny, fragile piece of herself begin to knit back together. She was so absorbed in her task, in the simple, repetitive motion of scrubbing a carrot, that she didn't hear the cabin door creak open. She didn't notice the small figure that emerged from the shadows and stood watching her from the edge of the porch. It was only when a small voice, clear and curious as a bird's call, cut through the silence that she looked up. "Are you a ghost?" Standing there was a little boy, no older than 6 or 7. He was small for his age, with a tangle of dark hair that fell into his eyes, and he wore a simple nightshirt that was too big for him. He wasn't afraid. His wide, solemn eyes were fixed on her with an unnerving, childlike intensity. He was looking at her tattered dress, the dirt and blood on her face, the way she seemed to have materialized out of the dark wilderness with the silent man who was, presumably, his father. From his perspective, the question made perfect sense. Lena stopped scrubbing. She looked down at her hands, raw and red in the lantern light spilling from the doorway. She looked at her filthy, torn dress, at the dark bruises beginning to bloom on her arms. She thought of the train, of the fall, of the desperate run through the dust. She felt like a ghost, a pale imitation of the person she had been just yesterday, a spirit haunted by the memory of a life that was now lost to her forever. She looked back at the boy, at his serious, waiting face. A dozen answers went through her mind. No, of course not. Don't be silly. But none of them felt true. She was too tired for lies. She gave him the only truth she had left. A small, weary smile touched her lips, the first she had felt in an age. "Not today," she said, her voice soft. The first light of dawn was a pale, gray wash that crept over the eastern hills, slowly erasing the stars. Lena awoke to it, her body stiff and protesting from a sleep that had been more like a collapse. She was on the porch, wrapped in a coarse but surprisingly warm wool blanket that she didn't remember being given. A bedroll had been placed beneath her, cushioning her from the hard planks. Her first conscious thought was not of fear, but of the deep, aching geography of her own bruises. The cabin was silent. She sat up slowly, the blanket falling into her lap, and looked out at the valley. The world was hushed, bathed in a soft, pre-dawn glow. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of dust and dry grass and the faint, wood smoke smell of a fire long dead. In the corral, the lone horse stood with its head bowed, dozing on its feet. Nothing moved but the cool morning breeze stirring the leaves of a gnarled cottonwood tree by the well. This quiet was a foreign country. Her life, for as long as she could remember, had been a cacophony of noise, the angry shouts of her father, the boisterous, threatening laughter in saloons, the constant, grinding anxiety in her own head. Silence had always been the tense, breathless moment before the storm broke. But this silence was different. It was vast, calm, and ancient. It didn't hold a threat, it held peace. The cabin door opened with a soft creak, and Caleb stepped out. He moved with the quiet economy of a man who lives alone, his boots making almost no sound on the wooden porch. He was already dressed, his hat on his head, and he carried a bridle in his hand. He glanced at her, a brief, assessing look from under the brim of his hat. His eyes were clear, his face showing no sign of the previous day's brutal exertion. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement that she was awake, that she had survived the night. Then he walked past her, down the steps, and towards the corral. A few moments later, the boy, Theo, appeared in the doorway. Rubbing the sleep from his eyes, he looked at Lena, his solemn gaze taking in her strange presence on his porch once again. He pointed a small finger towards the barn. "Pa's going to fix the fence post," he announced, his voice soft in the morning air. It wasn't an invitation or a question, just a statement of fact, the sharing of a daily routine that her arrival had interrupted. Lena felt that same sense of displacement as the night before. This was their life, their home. She was a foreign object, a problem they hadn't asked for. The need to be useful, to earn her keep, was a physical ache. She got to her feet, ignoring the protests of her muscles, and folded the blanket and bedroll neatly, placing them against the cabin wall. Inside, the cabin was a single, large room, rustic and spare. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center. In one corner was a large bed where Caleb and Theo must have slept, and in the other, a small cooking area with a cast-iron stove and shelves holding a modest collection of pots and tin plates. The place was clean, meticulously so, but it was undeniably the home of men. There were no curtains on the windows, no cloth on the table, no softness to be found anywhere. Lena found the water bucket was nearly empty. She took it, and though her arm screamed in protest at the weight, she carried it to the well and began the slow, squeaking work of drawing water. The simple, physical labor was grounding. With each turn of the crank, she felt as if she were pulling herself up from a deep, dark place. And so the days began, falling into a rhythm as steady and predictable as the rising and setting of the sun. It was a life measured not in words, but in tasks. Language was a currency they rarely spent. Caleb and Theo would rise before dawn, their movements quiet and purposeful. They would tend to the horse, mend what was broken, a fence post, a roof shingle, a piece of harness, and work the stubborn patch of land that served as their garden. Lena, in turn, found her own domain. She took over the cooking, turning their meager supplies of flour, beans, and the vegetables she had washed into simple, hearty meals. She scrubbed the cabin until the wooden floors shone. She found Caleb's sewing kit a simple affair of a few needles and spools of coarse thread and began to mend. She repaired the tear in his shirt, her stitches small and even. She patched a hole in Theo's trousers. She even took her own ruined dress and, with painstaking care, salvaged enough fabric to sew herself a crude but sturdy apron. Theo was the bridge between their 2 silent worlds. He would follow his father, handing him tools and asking a constant stream of questions in his clear, high voice. Then he would wander back to the cabin, where he would sit at the table and watch Lena knead dough, his chin resting in his hands, his eyes wide with a quiet curiosity. He chattered to her as he did to his father, telling her about a lizard he had seen, or asking her why the sky was blue. Lena would answer him softly, her voice still rough from disuse, and the small, simple conversations were like a balm to her spirit. But between Lena and Caleb, the silence remained. A vast space they navigated with a careful, unspoken courtesy. Yet, within that silence, a new language began to form, a dialect of quiet gestures and small, significant acts. One afternoon, the sun was particularly fierce. Lena was in the garden, her back aching as she pulled weeds from around the struggling corn stalks. The heat was a physical weight, and the dust she kicked up coated her throat. When she finally gave up and walked back to the cabin, thirsty and exhausted, she found a tin cup of cool water sitting on the porch railing, condensation beating on its sides. Caleb was on the other side of the yard, sharpening an axe blade, his back to her. He hadn't seen her coming, but he had known she would be thirsty. He had left the water for her. Lena drank it down, the cold liquid a shock of grace, and a strange warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. A few days later, a sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled through the valley. The sky turned a bruised purple, and rain lashed down in silver sheets. Caleb was caught out in it, trying to secure a loose section of the barn roof. He came inside drenched and shivering, his shirt plastered to his skin. The next morning, when he went to get dressed, he found his damp clothes were not where he had left them. Lena had hung them by the stove to dry, and his worn work boots, which had been caked in mud, were clean and oiled, placed neatly by the hearth. He looked over at her. She was sweeping the floor, her movements focused, her face averted. She did not acknowledge his gaze, but he saw the faint flush on her cheeks. Slowly, the distance that separated them began to shrink, not in physical space, but in the nature of their shared existence. They began to eat together at the small table, Theo sitting between them. The meals were quiet affairs, the only sounds the scrape of forks on tin plates and Theo's occasional chatter. But sharing a table felt like a profound intimacy, a quiet declaration that they were, for now, a unit, 3 people against the wilderness. They worked in the same yard, their tasks often complementary. When Caleb chopped wood, Lena would stack it. When he brought in a bucket of milk from the neighbor's goat he sometimes tended, she would strain it and set it to cool. They moved around each other with a developing grace, an instinctive awareness of the other's presence, like 2 solitary animals learning to share the same territory. In the evenings, after Theo was asleep, a new ritual formed. Caleb would sit on the top step of the porch, cleaning his tools or mending a piece of leather in the fading light. Lena would sit on the bottom step, patching clothes or simply watching the stars ignite in the vast, dark sky. They rarely spoke, but the shared space, the comfortable proximity, was a conversation in itself. It said, "I am here. You are here. We are not alone." One evening, as she sat mending a tear in the blanket he had given her, she looked up and saw that he had stopped his work and was watching her. His face, in the soft twilight, looked less hard. The harsh lines etched by sun and hardship softened. His pale eyes held a quiet, questioning look. Lena's fingers stilled on the needle. Her heart gave a sudden, unfamiliar flutter. She held his gaze for a long moment, and in that silent exchange, something shifted. The wall of careful neutrality that had stood between them developed its first crack. She looked down at her sewing, her heart beating a little faster, and a slow, shy smile touched her lips. He had given her the porch as her space. Each night, she would unroll her bedroll, and he and Theo would retreat inside, closing the door softly behind them. This boundary, this clear delineation of space, was the greatest gift he could have given her. For the first time in years, she could lie down to sleep without fear. She knew that no one would burst through the door, that no harm would come to her in the night. The solid wall of the cabin at her back and the presence of the quiet, capable man on the other side of it were a fortress. Her body began to heal. The cuts and scrapes faded. The angry purple of her bruises softened to a pale yellow, and then disappeared altogether. But the real healing was happening somewhere deeper, in a place she thought had been destroyed forever. The knot of terror that had lived in her stomach for so long began to loosen its grip. She found herself breathing more deeply, sleeping through the night without waking from nightmares. She started to notice the small beauties of the valley, the way the morning light turned the tips of the grass to gold, the intricate pattern of a spider's web beaded with dew, the brave splash of color from a single Indian paintbrush flower growing by the creek. One day, she found a whole patch of them. On her way back to the cabin, she picked one, its brilliant red-orange petals a stark contrast to the muted greens and browns of the landscape. Without thinking, without planning, she laid it on the porch step where Caleb always sat. It was a small, impulsive gesture, a thank you for the water, for the shelter, for the quiet space he had given her to heal. Later that evening, when he came to sit on the step, he saw the flower. He stopped, looking down at the small splash of color. He bent and picked it up, holding it gently in his rough, calloused fingers. He looked at it for a long time. Lena, watching from the doorway, felt her breath catch in her throat. She expected him to discard it, to see it as a foolish, useless thing. But he didn't. He slowly, deliberately, tucked the stem of the flower into the worn leather band of his hat. He sat down, and the silence between them was different that night. It was warmer, softer, filled with the unspoken weight of that single, brilliant flower. Lena watched the first stars appear, and she wrapped her arms around her knees, a feeling of profound and unfamiliar peace settling over her like a warm blanket. She was safe. For the first time in so long she could barely remember, she was truly, deeply safe. The day dissolved into a soft, bruised twilight, the kind that settles over the plains like a held breath. Supper had been a quiet affair, as usual, a simple stew of beans and salted pork, eaten from tin plates at the rough-hewn table. Theo, his small body heavy with the day's exertions, had nearly fallen asleep over his meal. Caleb had lifted him from his chair, the boy's head falling limp against his father's shoulder, and carried him to the bed in the corner. He had tucked him in, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as they smoothed the blanket. Lena watched the quiet, domestic scene from her place at the table. The soft glow of the kerosene lamp cast long, dancing shadows on the log walls, turning the small cabin into a sanctuary against the immense, dark world outside. The sight of Caleb's gentle care for his son stirred something deep within her, a dull, phantom ache for a tenderness she had never known. When Caleb turned back from the bed, the cabin was still. Theo's soft, even breathing was the only sound besides the low crackle of the embers in the hearth. The remnants of their meal sat on the table between them. Lena stood and began to gather the plates, moving with the quiet efficiency that had become her habit. It was a simple task, scraping the plates and carrying them to the dry sink. But it was an anchor. Caleb moved to the stove and lifted the heavy kettle, pouring a stream of hot water into the wash basin. He did it without being asked, a simple, fluid motion that spoke of a shared routine, an unspoken partnership. He set the kettle back down and picked up a clean, dry cloth from a hook on the wall. Lena dipped her hands into the warm, soapy water. The heat was a comfort to her skin, a small, physical pleasure. She began to wash the first plate, the scrape of her cloth against the tin a small, rhythmic sound in the quiet room. Caleb stood beside her, not too close but not far, and took the wet plate from her. His fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second, he began to dry it, his motions as methodical and unhurried as her own. They worked in silence for several minutes, a comfortable, companionable quiet that had become the foundation of their strange life together. But tonight, the silence felt different. It was heavier, filled with the things that had been left unsaid for weeks. The simple act of his pouring the water, of standing beside her to share a chore, had been an act of kindness, And kindness, she was learning, was a key that could unlock the most rusted and stubborn of doors. The memories began to surface, unbidden, like ghosts rising from a mist. They were triggered by the simplest things. The smell of the soap reminded her of the lye soap her mother used to make. The warmth of the water a stark contrast to the cold dread that had been her constant companion. "My mother," she began, her voice so soft it was almost a part of the silence. She loved blue wildflowers. She used to say they were the color of hope. She paused, scrubbing a plate that was already clean. "After she was gone, my father, he stopped seeing color in anything. I think—" Caleb made no sound of encouragement, no prompt for her to continue. He simply took the plate she was holding and began to dry it, his presence a steady, non-judgmental weight beside her. His silence was an invitation. It gave her permission to speak, to fill the space with her own story without fear of interruption or pity. "He wasn't always a hard man," she said, her gaze distant, looking through the cabin wall and into the past. "Before the drink took hold of him, he would laugh sometimes. He taught me how to read, but the whiskey, it washed everything away. It washed away his laughter, his kindness, his memory of my mother. All that was left was a hollowness that he tried to fill with anger." She remembered the smell, the sour, cloying scent of whiskey that clung to the house like a shroud. In the curtains, in the floorboards, in his clothes. She remembered the sound of his unsteady footsteps on the porch, the way her stomach would clench in anticipation of the mood he would bring home with him. "He had debts," she continued, her voice flat, recounting the facts as if they belonged to someone else. "He owed money to a man in town, a man with a heavy ledger and a heavier hand. Mr. Blackwood." She said the name, and it felt like a shard of glass in her mouth. Caleb's hand stilled for a fraction of a second on the plate he was wiping. It was the only sign that he had heard, that the name meant something to him. Silas, on the train, had mentioned it, something that belongs to Mr. Blackwood. Now he knew what that something was. "Blackwood was not a patient man," Lena whispered, "and my father, he had nothing left to sell, nothing but me." The memory was sharp, painful. The day Blackwood had come to their small, dusty house. He hadn't looked at her father. He had looked at her, his eyes cold and assessing, the way a rancher looks at livestock he's about to purchase. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a chilling sense of ownership. He had smiled, a thin, cruel slash of a smile that did not reach his eyes, and Lena had felt a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. My father called it a marriage, an arrangement to secure my future, but I knew what it was. I was a debt, being paid. I saw the way Blackwood looked at me. I heard the stories in town, the whispers about his temper, about the things he broke when he was angry. She remembered standing in the small parlor, her father refusing to meet her eyes, while Blackwood spoke of the wedding as if she were not in the room. His voice was a low rumble, and in it she heard the sound of a cage door swinging shut. She fell silent, her hands submerged in the now lukewarm water. Caleb took another dish from her. He did not look at her, but she could feel his attention, a focused, powerful stillness that seemed to draw the story out of her. "The night before I was to be married." She struggled with the word. "I waited until my father was asleep, or passed out. It was usually the same thing." The memory of that night was a series of sharp, terrifying sensations. The oppressive silence of the house, broken only by her father's ragged snores from the other room. The moonlight slanting through the grimy window, painting bars of silver on the floor. Every creaking floorboard under her bare feet sounded like a gunshot. My mother had left me a ring, just a simple silver band with a small blue stone. She said it was for my wedding day. I took it. She could still feel the cold, smooth weight of it in her palm, a last tangible link to a life of love and hope. It was all she had left of her mother, and she couldn't bear the thought of Blackwood's hands touching it. I took the ring and the few coins I had saved in a jar under my bed. It wasn't much, just enough for a train ticket to anywhere. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. She remembered slipping out the back door into the cold, sharp air of the night, the sound of her own frantic heartbeat thundering in her ears. She had run, her bare feet stumbling on the dark, rutted road, not daring to look back, terrified that at any moment a hand would fall on her shoulder and drag her back to the cage. She reached the last dish, a small tin bowl. She washed it slowly, her movements automatic. The water had grown cold. I hid in the woods until the morning train came. I bought a ticket as far as my money would take me. I thought if I could just get far enough away, I would be safe. She let out a small, humorless laugh. I was so naive. I didn't understand that men like Blackwood don't just let things go. To them, everything has a price. Everything is a possession. She pulled her hands from the water and reached for a cloth to dry them. But her hands were shaking too much. The memories were too close, too real. The terror of the train. The moment she had seen Silas and his men walking through the cars, their faces grim and purposeful. The certainty that her brief, desperate flight was over. It all came rushing back. She wrapped her arms around herself, a tremor running through her body. The whole story, the whole ugly, painful truth of her life, was finally out, hanging in the air of the small, quiet cabin. She felt raw, exposed, as if she had peeled back her own skin. She looked at Caleb, her eyes pleading for, she didn't know what. Understanding absolution. She finally gave voice to the deepest, darkest fear she had carried, the one that had lived with her since that desperate moment in the train car. I didn't think I'd make it past the train, she whispered, her voice breaking. When I saw those men coming, I thought it was over. I thought there was no place left to run. Caleb stopped drying the last bowl. He placed it carefully on the shelf and turned to face her fully. The lamplight carved his face into stark planes of light and shadow. He looked at her, his pale eyes holding hers, and there was no pity in them. There was something else, something harder and more profound. There was acknowledgement. He had seen the terror in her that day. He had seen the ragged edge she was clinging to. He did not deny her despair. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. His gaze was steady, unwavering, a bedrock of certainty in her swirling sea of fear. But you did, he said. The words were plain, simple. 4 small words that held no praise, no sentimentality. They were just a statement of fact, a truth. He was not telling her she was strong or brave. He was telling her she was a survivor. He was reflecting her own resilience back at her, not as a compliment, but as an undeniable fact of her existence. I was going to die, but you did not. And in that moment, something inside Lena that had been broken for a very long time shifted. The shame she had carried, the feeling of being a victim, a piece of property, receded. He saw her not as a runaway girl or a piece of trouble, but as someone who had faced the end and was still standing. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sadness or fear. It was a tear of release. She had told her story, and she had been heard. She had confessed her deepest fear, and it had been met not with pity, but with respect. He held her gaze for a second longer, then turned and hung the damp cloth back on its hook. The conversation was over. The dishes were done. The story had been told. The air in the cabin felt clearer, lighter. A great unspoken weight had been lifted, leaving behind a new, more solid foundation of trust in its place. The peace of the valley had become a tangible thing, a gentle weight in the air that settled over them like a soft blanket. Weeks had passed since Lena's story had been told, and in the wake of her confession, the last of the fragile barriers between them had dissolved. The silence was now one of deep, comfortable understanding. It was a late afternoon, the sun slanting low and turning the valley a dusty gold. A fragile sense of permanence had begun to take root. Lena was kneeling in the garden, humming a tuneless song as she carefully harvested the last of the season's carrots. Theo was beside her, his small hands inexpertly pulling weeds, his face smudged with dirt. Caleb was at the edge of the yard, splitting logs with a steady, powerful rhythm. The rhythmic thud of his axe was the valley's heartbeat, a sound of security and provision. For the first time, Lena felt the quiet stirrings of a future she could imagine, a life built not on running, but on staying. The sound that broke the peace was faint at first, a distant drumming that was not the beat of Caleb's axe. It was the sound of hoofbeats, fast and purposeful, coming from the direction of the high ridge that guarded the valley's entrance. Lena's head snapped up, her hands still caked with soil. The humming died in her throat. Caleb had stopped, his axe held motionless in mid-swing. He stood perfectly still, a statue of listening dread, his head cocked towards the sound. Then they appeared, 3 riders, cresting the ridge, their forms dark silhouettes against the bright afternoon sky. Even at this distance, there was no mistaking the menacing set of their shoulders, the ruthless way they spurred their horses down the steep incline. The blood drained from Lena's face, leaving a cold, hollow feeling in its place. The fragile peace shattered into a million pieces. The past, which had seemed so distant, was suddenly here, a tangible, galloping threat. It was them, Silas and his men. Caleb, the name was a strangled cry, torn from her throat. Her voice, which had grown soft and steady in the valley's quiet, was once again sharp with raw terror. They found us. The moment the words left her mouth, Caleb was in motion. He dropped the axe and sprinted across the yard, his face a hard, cold mask. The quiet homesteader was gone, replaced in an instant by the deadly, decisive man from the train. He didn't waste a second on questions. Inside, he roared, his voice a whip crack that cut through Lena's paralysis. He scooped Theo up with one arm, the boy letting out a startled cry, "Lena!" Now. She scrambled to her feet and ran, her heart hammering against her ribs with a violence that made her feel sick. She and Caleb reached the cabin door at the same time. He shoved her and Theo inside, into the familiar, lamp-lit dimness that no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a trap. He slammed the heavy wooden door shut and threw the thick iron bolt across. The sound echoed in the small space like a coffin lid closing. He gently but quickly set Theo down. "Stay away from the window. Son, stay behind the table." The boy, his eyes wide with a confusion that was quickly turning to fear, scurried to obey, hiding behind the thick legs of the table. Caleb turned, his eyes sweeping the room. They were stark and pale, the eyes of a wolf backed into its den. He moved to the fireplace and took down the rifle that was mounted above the mantel. He checked the load with a series of swift, economical movements that spoke of long and violent familiarity. He pulled a heavy Colt revolver from a wooden box on the shelf and thrust it into Lena's hands. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. She stared down at the gun. It was impossibly heavy, a cold, brutal weight in her trembling hands. She had never held a weapon before in her life. She shook her head, unable to speak. "Just point it," he said, his voice grim, "and pull the trigger. Don't think, just pull." A thunderous pounding on the door made them both jump. Caleb deigned Silas's voice, a triumphant, hateful sneer, carried through the thick wood. "We know you're in there, and we know you've got Mr. Blackwood's property. Send the girl out, and we'll let you and the boy live." Caleb ignored him. He moved to the single window, staying to the side, and peered through a small gap. "3 of them," he said, his voice a low murmur, same as before. "What do they want with you?" Lena whispered, her voice shaking. She couldn't take her eyes off the door, expecting it to splinter and burst inward at any second. "They don't want me," Caleb said, his gaze still fixed on the scene outside. "They followed your trail. It must have taken them this long to pick it up again." They're bounty men. Blackwood must have put a high price on you." The pounding on the door intensified, accompanied by the splintering crack of wood. They were using a log as a battering ram. The door groaned, the iron hinges shrieking in protest. "Last chance!" Dane Silas roared. Caleb moved away from the window and took up a position near the door, his rifle raised. His face was devoid of all emotion except a cold, lethal concentration. He was ready. The door exploded inward with a deafening crash, ripped from its hinges and thrown across the floor. For a heartbeat, the doorway was filled with dust and glaring sunlight. Then the men poured in. The brutish one from the train came first, a heavy club in his hand. Caleb's rifle cracked, the sound so loud in the confined space that it felt like a physical blow. The man grunted and staggered back, clutching a wound in his shoulder. But he wasn't down. He was followed by the weasel, who held a long, wicked-looking knife. Silas came last, his pistol drawn. The cabin erupted into a chaos of violence. Caleb fired again, but the men were too close. The brute swung his club, and Caleb was forced to use his rifle to block the blow. The stock splintered, and the weapon was knocked from his hands. He drew a knife from his belt and met the brute's charge. They crashed against the table, a maelstrom of grunts and curses. The weasel darted towards Lena, his eyes glittering. She backed away, the heavy Colt in her hands feeling useless and foreign. She tried to raise it, to point it as Caleb had said, but her arms felt like lead. Her mind was a white noise of terror. Silas saw her hesitation. He saw something else, too, a smaller, more valuable prize. With a chilling grin, he lunged, not for Lena, but for the space behind the table. Lena screamed. Silas was fast. He grabbed the boy, yanking him from his hiding place. Theo cried out, a thin, terrified wail. Silas spun him around, holding the small, struggling body as a shield. He pressed the cold, sharp blade of a knife to the boy's throat. "Drop it," Dane Silas snarled, "or the boy gets it." The fight stopped. Caleb, who had just managed to down the brute with a punishing blow to the head, froze. He looked at his son, at the terror in Theo's eyes, at the thin line of red that was beginning to well up where the knife pressed against his skin. Caleb's face went pale, his expression one of utter, helpless agony. The weasel, seeing his advantage, moved to stand beside his leader, his own knife held ready. The world seemed to slow down. The dust motes danced in the shafts of light from the broken doorway. The sound of Theo's frightened whimpers was a physical pain in Lena's chest. She looked at Caleb's face, at the raw despair of a father forced to watch his child threatened. She looked at Theo, so small, so innocent, his life held hostage by these brutal men. And in that moment, something inside Lena snapped. The fear was still there, a cold, sickening river in her veins, but something else rose to meet it, a hot, protective rage that burned away the last vestiges of the victim she had once been. This was not about her anymore. This was not about running. This was about this boy, this man, this small, precious life they had built in this valley. This was her home, and these men would not take it from her. Her hands, which had been trembling uncontrollably, grew steady. Her grip on the heavy Colt tightened. She raised the gun, the long barrel feeling like an extension of her own will. She sighted down it, her gaze locking onto Silas. Her eyes, which had been wide with terror, were now narrowed and filled with a cold, hard light that mirrored Caleb's own. "Let him go," she said. Her voice did not tremble. It was low, steady, and resonated with a power she had never known she possessed. Silas's grin faltered. He looked at her, at this girl he had dismissed as a piece of property, and saw someone he didn't recognize. He saw a woman made of iron and fire. "I said," Lena repeated, taking a step forward. "Let him go, or I swear." Crack! The gunshot was not from her gun. It came from outside, from the broken doorway. It was a rifle shot, loud and authoritative. A chunk of wood exploded from the doorframe just inches from Silas's head, showering him with splinters. He flinched violently, his eyes darting towards the source of the shot. The weasel yelped and ducked. In that single, split second of distraction, Lena's mind went silent. There was no thought, no hesitation. There was only the image of Theo's terrified face and the cold, steady purpose that filled her. She pulled the trigger. The Colt bucked in her hand with a force that jarred her all the way to her shoulder. The explosion was deafening. The cabin filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Silas screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and surprise. He dropped his knife and staggered back, clutching his shoulder. A dark, blossoming stain of red was spreading across his shirt. The shot, while not a killing one, had been effective. His grip on Theo loosened. Caleb moved like a lightning strike. He surged forward, grabbing his son and pulling him into his arms, shielding him with his own body. He scrambled back, putting the table between them and the injured men. The weasel looked from his wounded leader to the old man now stepping into the doorway, a long hunting rifle held at the ready. The man, weathered and lean, with a grim set to his jaw, was a stranger to Lena, but clearly not to the situation. It was Raoul, their nearest neighbor from the next valley over, likely drawn by the sound of the first shots. The fight was over. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted. Silas, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face a mask of pain and fury, stared at Lena. He looked at the smoking gun in her hand and the unyielding fury in her eyes, and he finally understood. This was not the frightened girl from the train. This was someone else entirely. "This ain't over," he hissed, but the threat was empty. He turned and stumbled out of the broken doorway, the weasel scurrying after him. The brute, groaning, managed to pull himself to his feet and followed his leader, leaving a trail of blood on the floor. They ran. They scrambled onto their horses and galloped away, disappearing over the ridge as quickly as they had appeared, leaving a sudden, ringing silence in their wake. The immediate danger was gone, but the cabin, their sanctuary, was a wreck. The door was shattered, the floor was stained with blood, and the air was thick with the smell of violence. Caleb was holding Theo, murmuring soft, comforting words to the sobbing boy. Raoul stood in the doorway, his rifle still held ready, his weathered face grim, and Lena stood in the center of it all, the heavy Colt still clutched in her hand, the barrel still smoking. Her arm was trembling now, a violent post-adrenaline tremor, but her gaze was fixed on the open doorway, on the empty ridge where her enemies had disappeared. She had faced the monster from her past, and she had not run. She had shot it. The silence that followed their escape was a deafening, ringing thing. It was heavier than the gunfire, more profound than the screams. Dust, thick and golden in the shafts of late afternoon light, settled slowly on the scene of brutal violation. The cabin, their small island of peace, was scarred. The door lay in splinters, a testament to the savagery that had invaded their world. The floor was scuffed with the marks of a desperate struggle and stained with the dark, ugly spots of a stranger's blood. Raoul, the old rancher, stood in the ruined doorway, his rifle held loosely in one hand. His weathered face was a grim mask, his eyes taking in the wreckage. Caleb was on his knees, his back to the room, holding Theo tightly against his chest. The boy's small body was racked with sobs, his face buried in his father's shoulder. Caleb was murmuring to him, a low, continuous stream of comforting sounds that was more animal than human, the instinctive croon of a parent shielding his young. Lena stood frozen in the center of the room. The heavy Colt had fallen from her nerveless fingers and lay on the floorboards. A stark, metal thing, her arm, the one that had fired the shot, trembled violently from the shock and the unfamiliar recoil. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled her nostrils, a scent that would forever be linked in her mind with this terrible, triumphant moment. The immediate threat was gone, but the violence lingered in the air like a foul poison. It was in this fragile, ringing silence that the world tilted and shattered once more. The brute, the one Caleb had felled near the table, was not unconscious. He had been playing possum, or perhaps the blow had only stunned him. With a guttural, inhuman roar, he surged up from the floor. He was a creature of pure, mindless rage, his face a mask of blood and fury, his eyes glazed with pain. In his hand, he still clutched the heavy, splintered club. Raoul, seeing the movement, began to bring his rifle up, but he was too far away. Lena cried out a wordless warning. Caleb, his entire being focused on comforting his son, was tragically vulnerable. He heard Lena's cry and started to turn, his protective instincts flaring, but he was a fraction of a second too late. The club swung in a vicious, desperate arc. It connected with the side of Caleb's head with a sickening, wet thud that seemed to echo in the sudden, dead silence that followed. Caleb's body went limp. He collapsed sideways, a dead weight, his arms falling away from his son. Theo, suddenly unsupported, tumbled to the floor beside his father. Caleb lay still, unnaturally so, on the dusty floorboards. A dark, glistening pool of red began to spread from beneath his head, staining the pale wood of the floor. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The scene was a tableau of horror. Then Raoul's rifle cracked, a final, definitive explosion that put an end to the brute's rampage. The big man crumpled to the floor and did not move again. But Lena didn't see it. She didn't hear the second shot. Her entire universe had contracted to the still, broken form of the man on the floor. The man who had hidden her, who had run with her, who had given her a home. A scream tore from her throat, a sound of such raw, primal agony that it seemed to scrape the very soul from her body. She scrambled across the floor, falling to her knees beside him. "Caleb," she cried, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch, afraid of what she would find. His face was waxen, his eyes closed. The blood was spreading, a slow, inexorable tide. "No, no, please, no." She looked at his chest, desperate for the familiar, steady rise and fall of his breathing. But there was nothing, only a terrible, absolute stillness. The hope he had given her, the safety she had found, the future she had just begun to imagine, it was all draining away, disappearing into the floorboards with his life's blood. The terror she thought she had conquered came rushing back, a black, suffocating wave. But this was a new kind of terror, deeper and more painful than any she had known before. It was the terror of loss. She leaned close, her ear next to his lips, praying, pleading with a God she had long forgotten. "Don't you leave me now." The words were a ragged, desperate sob, a command hurled against the encroaching darkness. "Don't you dare leave me." And in the depths of her despair, she felt it, a tiny, almost imperceptible puff of air against her cheek, a ghost of a breath. It was so faint she thought she had imagined it. She held her own breath, listening with every fiber of her being. And there it was again, a shallow, hitching intake of air, followed by a slow, weak exhale. He was alive. The knowledge was not a wave of relief, but a tiny, flickering candle flame in a hurricane. It was a chance, a fragile, desperate, terrifying chance. "Raoul," she cried, her voice sharp with a new, fierce urgency. "He's breathing, help me." The old man was at her side in an instant. His grim, practical gaze took in the scene. "The wound on his head is bad. We need to stop the bleeding, and we need to get him onto the bed." The hours that followed were a blur of desperate, focused activity. The terror did not leave, but Lena shoved it into a corner of her mind and walled it off. There was no time for fear. There was only time to fight. Raoul, his hands surprisingly steady for a man his age, showed her what to do. They gently, carefully, rolled Caleb over. The gash on his temple was deep and ugly. Lena's stomach churned, but she forced the feeling down. She tore strips from one of the few clean sheets she had, her hands moving with a speed and precision she didn't know she possessed. She washed the wound as best she could with water from the kettle, her touch gentle, her murmurs a constant, soothing litany. "It's all right. Caleb, you're all right. Just hold on." Together, she and Raoul managed to lift him, his body a heavy, unresponsive weight, and carry him to the bed. They laid him down, and his head lolled to one side, his face ashen against the coarse pillowcase. Raoul stayed for as long as he could. He helped her clean the cabin, dragging the body of the brute outside. He nailed the splintered door back into its frame, a crude but effective barrier against the coming night. He made sure she had enough firewood and water. "He's a strong man," Raoul said, his hand resting on her shoulder for a moment before he left. "But it's in God's hands now." Lena simply nodded, her eyes never leaving Caleb's still form. When the old man was gone, a profound and terrifying silence descended on the cabin once more. Theo, who had been huddled in a corner, his small face pale with shock, crept to her side. He didn't speak, just leaned against her, his small hand clutching her skirt. And so began the vigil. The days and nights bled into one another, marked only by the shifting of the light through the single window and the state of Caleb's fever. He burned with it, his skin hot and dry to the touch, his unconsciousness punctuated by low, pained moans and restless tossing. Lena did not leave his side. She was a ghost in the small cabin, moving between the bed, the hearth, and the well. She slept in snatches, sitting in the chair beside him, her head falling forward onto her chest for a few minutes at a time, jerking awake at his every sound. She spooned water and thin, watery broth between his cracked lips, a few drops at a time, praying he would swallow. She bathed his face and chest with cool, damp cloths, trying to fight the fever that was consuming him. She changed the dressing on his head, her heart in her throat each time, terrified of what she would find. Theo was her small, silent shadow. He helped in his own way. He would bring her a cup of water, his small hands holding it so carefully. He would fetch more wood for the fire. Mostly, he would just sit on a small stool near the bed, watching his father, his young face a mask of silent worry. His presence was both a comfort and a constant, aching reminder of what was at stake. Raoul came every day. He brought supplies, a little milk, some dried meat, a poultice of herbs that he said would help with the fever. He would check on Caleb, his experienced eyes assessing the small, almost imperceptible changes. He would speak to Lena in a low, encouraging voice, but always, he would leave, and she would be alone again with the silence and the shallow, ragged breathing of the man in the bed. She talked to Caleb constantly, her voice a low, desperate murmur in the quiet room. She told him about her day, about the way the sun was hitting the valley floor, about the meal she was cooking for Theo. She told him he had to get better, that Theo needed him, that she needed him. "You can't go," she whispered to him one night, as she wiped the sweat from his brow, the flickering lamplight casting deep shadows under her own exhausted eyes. "You can't. You brought me here. You brought me to this quiet place. You can't leave me alone in it." There were times, in the deepest, darkest hours before dawn, when his breathing would become so shallow, so faint, that she would lean over him, her own breath held, her heart frozen with fear, until she felt the tiny, weak puff of air that meant he was still with her. Each breath was a victory. Each sunrise was a miracle. On the fourth day, the fever broke. She awoke from a brief, troubled sleep to find him drenched in sweat, but his skin was cool to the touch for the first time. His breathing, while still weak, was deeper, more regular. A fragile, bugan xiangshin de shi wang kai shi zai tashin zhongmeng ya. She spent the day in a state of heightened, exhausted tension. He was no longer burning up, but he remained lost in the deep, dark well of unconsciousness. She continued her vigil, whispering to him, holding his limp hand, willing him to come back to her, to Theo, to the life that was waiting for him. The sun was just beginning to rise on the 5th day. The light was soft and gray, filtering into the quiet cabin. Lena was sitting in her usual chair, her head resting on the edge of the mattress, her hand covering his. She was so tired she could barely keep her eyes open. She must have dozed off. A faint pressure. It was so slight she thought it was a muscle twitch, a dream. But then it came again, a weak but definite pressure against her fingers. Her head snapped up. Her heart leaped into her throat. She stared at their joined hands. His fingers, which had been limp and unresponsive for so long, had moved. She looked at his face, and his eyes were open. They were not clear. They were clouded with pain and a deep, hazy confusion, but they were open, and they were looking at her. He blinked slowly, as if the effort was immense. His gaze drifted around the familiar cabin, then to Theo, who was asleep on a pallet of blankets on the floor. Finally, his eyes came back to rest on her face. Recognition flickered in their depths. "Lena," he breathed, his voice a dry, rasping whisper, the first word he had spoken since the attack. Tears she hadn't known she was holding back began to stream down her face. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a relief so profound it felt like a physical pain. She couldn't speak. She could only nod, a choked sob catching in her throat. He looked at their hands, at her small, work-roughened hand covering his larger, calloused one. His fingers tightened around hers, a movement that was still weak, but full of a deliberate, unmistakable strength. He didn't need to say anything else. There were no words for what had passed between them in this room, for the battle they had fought together. But in that simple, silent pressure of his hand, she felt it all. The gratitude, the acknowledgement, the profound, unbreakable bond that had been forged in blood and fear and the long, dark hours of the night. He was back. He was with her. And for now, that was enough. The fever was gone, but it had left Caleb hollowed out, a shadow of the man he had been. In the first days of his consciousness, he was a prisoner in his own body, his strength stolen by the wound and the fight his body had waged against it. A deep, quiet frustration settled in his eyes as he watched Lena move about the cabin, her presence a constant, gentle hum of activity. She managed everything tending to him, cooking for Theo, keeping the small homestead from falling into disarray with a calm competence that was a world away from the terrified girl he had first met. He was a man accustomed to giving aid, not receiving it. It was a profound and unsettling shift to be the one who was weak, the one who needed to be cared for. When she would bring him a bowl of thin broth, he would try to take it himself, his hand trembling with a weakness that infuriated him. She would not allow it. Her hand would close gently but firmly over his, guiding the spoon to his lips. "Just rest, Caleb," she would say, her voice soft but resolute. "Let me—" And in the face of her quiet insistence, he would relent. He would lean back against the pillows she had propped behind him and let her care for him. He would watch her face, the focused concentration in her eyes, the gentle set of her mouth, and a feeling he could not name would stir in his chest. It was more than gratitude. It was a deep, aching tenderness that he had not allowed himself to feel for anyone in a very long time. Theo, overjoyed to have his father back from the silent, scary place he had been, was a constant presence at the bedside. He would bring Caleb treasures from the yard, a smooth, gray stone, a fallen bird's feather, a misshapen carrot from the garden, and place them on the blanket. Caleb would smile, a weak but genuine curving of his lips, and his hand would rest on his son's head, and Lena, watching them, would feel a warmth spread through her, the quiet, powerful feeling of family, a thing she had thought was lost to her forever. As the days turned into weeks, a slow, arduous river of time, Caleb's strength began to return. First, he was able to sit in the chair by the fire, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Then, leaning heavily on a walking stick Raoul had carved for him, He made his first journey to the porch. He stood there, blinking in the bright autumn sunlight, his body still frail but his spirit undeniably mending. He breathed in the clean, crisp air of his valley, which these two people had helped him hold on to. A new routine began to form, one dictated by the slow, steady pace of his recovery. The explicit roles of patient and caregiver began to blur, replaced by something more subtle, more equal. There were no grand pronouncements, no dramatic declarations. Their growing affection was a quiet language spoken entirely through gestures, a romance of the most practical and profound kind. It began at the dinner table. Raoul had brought them a rabbit, and Lena had stewed it with wild onions and the last of the carrots, the rich smell filling the small cabin. Caleb was now strong enough to sit at the table with them, and he took the carving knife in his hand, a familiar tool that felt foreign after so long. He carved the tender meat, and before he served himself or the eagerly waiting Theo, he placed the choicest, most succulent piece onto Lena's plate. It was a simple act, the provider's gesture of honor and care, but it landed with the weight of a spoken promise. Lena looked up, surprised, her cheeks flushing a faint pink. She met his gaze across the table. His pale eyes were warm, steady, and in them, she saw a clear and simple message. You are valued here. You are one of us. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of thanks, and the quiet meal that followed felt like a celebration. The porch steps where Lena sat in the evenings were hard and often cold. She didn't mind. She was used to hardship. But one afternoon, she came out of the cabin to find a cushion waiting for her in her usual spot. It was a humble, handmade thing, a piece of an old burlap sack that she herself had mended, now stuffed with dried grasses and sewn shut with thick, clumsy stitches that were clearly Caleb's handiwork. He had seen her discomfort, a discomfort she had never even acknowledged to herself, and he had sought to remedy it. She sat down, the simple cushion a luxury beyond measure. He was on the other side of the porch, mending a bridle, his head bent over his work. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge his gift. He didn't have to. The thoughtful, practical tenderness of the act spoke for him. Lena ran her hand over the rough fabric, and she had to fight back the tears that pricked at her eyes. It was perhaps the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her. As his body healed, the physical space between them began to close. He no longer needed her help to walk, but sometimes, when he would stand, his hand would rest on her shoulder for a moment, a steadying gesture that was no longer strictly necessary. The touch was brief, but it sent a tremor of awareness through her. The most profound of these moments happened by the well. He was finally strong enough to draw the water himself, a milestone that brought a look of grim satisfaction to his face. He drew a full, splashing bucket and filled the dipper. He turned and held it out to her. As she reached to take it, his hand covered hers, his calloused fingers closing over her own. It was not a clumsy, accidental touch. It was deliberate. He held her hand there for a long, silent moment, the cool metal of the dipper pressing against their joined skin. It was the first time he had touched her with intention, not as a patient, not as a protector, but as a man. A current, warm and startling, passed between them. Lena's breath hitched in her throat. She looked up into his eyes and saw her own shock and awareness reflected there. The world seemed to shrink to the small, charged space between them, the only sound the gentle sigh of the wind through the cottonwood leaves. He released her hand as slowly as he had taken it. She took the dipper, her hand trembling slightly, and drank the cold water, though she was no longer thirsty. The gesture was complete. A question had been asked, and an answer had been given, all without a single word. The valley ripened into late autumn. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. The leaves on the cottonwood turned a brilliant, fiery yellow, and the air held the sharp, clean promise of the coming winter. Caleb was whole again. The wound on his head had healed into a pale scar, a faint line half hidden by his hair. He moved with his old strength and confidence, the walking stick now leaning, forgotten, in a corner of the cabin. But he was not the same man. The harsh, solitary shell he had worn had been cracked open. A quiet warmth now lived in his eyes, a softness that was reserved for Theo, and for her. One evening, they sat on the porch in the dying light. The sky was a breathtaking spectacle of deep purple and molten orange. A profound peace had settled over the valley. Theo was already asleep inside, tired out from a day of helping his father repair the corral. Lena sat on her cushioned step, and Caleb sat on the step above her, leaning back against a porch post. The comfortable silence stretched between them, a familiar, trusted companion. Lena looked out at the darkening hills, at the first star that pricked the velvet sky. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the terror and pain that had been the prelude to this unimaginable peace. The words rose in her, a quiet, necessary acknowledgement of the chasm between then and now. "At first," she began, her voice soft in the twilight stillness, "I only wanted a coat to hide under." It was a confession and a thank you, an admission of the desperate, frightened creature she had been. She had been looking for a momentary shadow to disappear into, a temporary reprieve from the hunt, and instead, she had found this, a home, a life. Caleb was silent for a long time. She could feel his gaze on her, and she turned her head to meet it. The last light of the sunset was reflected in his eyes, and they shone with an expression of such deep, unguarded warmth that it made her heart ache. He had no easy words for the feelings that had grown between them, no polished phrases for the powerful, unspoken bond they shared. His language was one of action, of truth, of survival. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough murmur, barely louder than the evening breeze, but his words were as solid and real as the ground beneath them. "Now," he said, his warm gaze holding hers, "I want you beside me, storm or sun." It was not a flowery declaration of love. It was something more. It was a vow, a statement of partnership, forged in the harsh reality of their world. He was not promising a life without hardship. He knew, better than anyone, that storms would come again. He was promising that when they did, he wanted her by his side. He was promising that he would be by hers. He was promising that they would face the darkness and the light together. A slow, radiant smile spread across Lena's face, the last of the old fear, the last shadow of the lonely, hunted girl she had been, dissolved in the warmth of his gaze. She reached out, her hand coming to rest on his knee, a simple, solid touch, the acceptance, the answer. He covered her hand with his own, his fingers lacing through hers, and they sat there together, in the quiet of the coming night, their hands entwined, watching the stars emerge one by one over their small, hard-won piece of the world. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a bed of glowing, orange embers, pulsing with a soft, residual heat that did little to combat the growing chill of the night. Outside, the wind had picked up, a lonely, keening sound as it swept down from the high plains and swirled through the small, sheltered valley. It was the sound of the vast, indifferent wilderness that surrounded them, a reminder of the world they had shut out. But inside the cabin, the wind's mournful song only served to deepen the sense of profound, quiet intimacy. Theo was fast asleep, lost in the deep, untroubled slumber of a child who feels utterly safe. Lena had tucked him in, smoothing his dark, tangled hair back from his forehead, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective love for this small boy who had so readily accepted her into his life. The cabin was tidy, the remnants of their simple supper cleaned and put away. The only light came from a single kerosene lamp on the table, its flame casting a warm, flickering golden glow on the log walls. Caleb stood near the hearth, his back to her. He had been checking the crude repair on the door, ensuring it would hold against the insistent push of the wind. Now he was still staring into the dying fire, lost in thought. The lamplight caught the sharp line of his jaw and the strong column of his neck. In the weeks since his recovery, he had shed the last of his gauntness, his body regaining its solid, capable strength. But the hardness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful warmth that she had come to treasure. Lena remained by the table, her hands resting on the smooth, worn wood. Her heart was a slow, heavy drum in her chest. The memory of his words on the porch, spoken in the fading light of sunset, echoed in her mind. "Now I want you beside me, storm or sun." It had not been a question, but a statement of his own heart. He had laid his truth before her, plain and unadorned. And now, the silence was filled with her unspoken answer. For her entire life, choices had been made for her. By her father's despair, by Blackwood's greed, by the desperate circumstances of her flight. She had reacted, she had run, she had survived. But she had never truly chosen. Her life had been a series of closed doors and narrow, dangerous paths she had been forced to take. Tonight was different. Tonight, for the first time, she stood before an open door. Not a door to escape through, but a door to walk through. A door to a life she could choose to begin. The thought was as terrifying as it was liberating. She had slept on the porch since the day she arrived. It had been her sanctuary, a space that was hers, a place where she could feel safe and separate. But the nights were growing colder, and the space between them, once a necessary buffer, now felt like a vast, empty canyon. His words had built a bridge across it. The only thing left was to decide if she was brave enough to cross. She pushed away from the table, her bare feet silent on the cool, smooth floorboards. The simple cabin was no longer just his place. It was hers, too. Her touch was everywhere in the neatly patched curtains she had made from a flour sack, in the clean-swept hearth, in the small jar of late-blooming wildflowers she had placed on the windowsill. This was the life her hands had helped to build. She walked slowly, hesitantly, towards the corner of the room where his bed was. It was a simple, sturdy frame he had built himself, covered with a thick patchwork quilt. The lamplight did not fully reach this corner, leaving it in a soft, intimate dimness. He was there now, having turned from the fire. He was pulling his worn bandana from around his neck, his movements slow and tired. He had not heard her approach. She stopped a few feet from the foot of the bed, her hands twisting in the fabric of her simple dress. The silence was absolute, save for the moan of the wind and the frantic, silent beating of her own heart. All the fears she thought she had conquered rose up in her, the fear of being a burden, the fear of misreading his intentions, the deep, ingrained fear of a man's power. But when she looked at him, at his quiet, unassuming strength, at the man who had faced down her pursuers and cared for his son with such tenderness, a different feeling rose to meet the fear. Trust, a deep, solid, and unwavering trust. He must have sensed her presence. He stopped, his hands frozen in the act of untying the knot. He looked up, and his eyes met hers across the shadowy space. There was no surprise in his gaze, only a quiet, patient waiting. He did not smile. He did not beckon her forward. He simply watched her, his expression open and unreadable, giving her the space to find her own words, her own courage. Her throat was dry. The question that had been screaming in her mind came out as a barely audible whisper, a fragile offering in the stillness. Should I turn around? It was the ultimate question. Am I welcome here? Do you truly want me? Or should I go back to my safe, separate space on the porch? It was a question that gave him all the power to accept or reject her, to close this final door in her face. Caleb's hands, which had been paused on the knot of his bandana, slowly fell to his sides. He looked at her, at the vulnerability in her stance, at the desperate hope and ancient fear that warred in her eyes. He saw not just the woman who had fought beside him, but the girl who had hidden beneath his coat, seeking only a moment's shelter. He understood, with a clarity that pierced his very soul, the weight of her question. He knew that his answer would define the rest of their lives. He could have said yes. He could have smiled and held out his hand, pulling her forward, ending her uncertainty. But he knew that was not what she needed. She didn't need to be pulled. She needed to choose to walk. She needed, for once in her life, for the choice to be entirely, completely, and unequivocally her own. He answered her, his voice as soft and gentle as the lamplight that flickered between them, a quiet murmur that held no demand, no persuasion, no pressure, only a profound and unconditional respect. Only if you want. The words settled over her, not with the force of a declaration, but with the grace of a gift. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her. He was not claiming her. He was freeing her. He was placing the key to her future, to their future, squarely in her own hand. The choice is yours. It has always been yours. The last of her fear dissolved, washed away by a wave of love so powerful it left her breathless. She looked at him, this quiet, honorable man who had seen the broken parts of her and had not tried to fix them, but had simply made a safe space for her to heal herself. This man who understood that true strength wasn't about taking, but about giving. She lifted her chin. The hesitation fell away, replaced by a calm, quiet certainty. She took a step forward, and then another. She walked the few feet that separated them, her gaze never leaving his. It was the longest and most important journey of her life. She stopped in front of him, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and laid it gently on his chest, over his heart. She could feel its steady, solid beat beneath her palm. It was the rhythm of home. He slowly raised his own hand and covered hers, his touch gentle, reverent. His skin was warm and rough against hers, a familiar, comforting texture. He did not pull her closer. He simply held her hand there, against his heart, sharing the quiet, powerful intimacy of the moment. There was no need for passion, no need for hurried kisses. That would come later, in its own time, as slowly and naturally as the turning of the seasons. Tonight was about something else. It was about the quiet, profound miracle of two broken souls, two people who had lost everything, finding their way to each other in the vast, lonely darkness. It was the silent, solemn vow of two hearts choosing to beat as one. It was the beginning of something new, something warm, something slow, something real. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. Your support means the world. And you can help us even more by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by many more people.